The partisan split on climate change is unmistakable. Democrats view the issue as one of their top two national issues. Republicans tend to worry more about the economic disruption that may result from efforts to reduce carbon emissions. Today's guest argues that for the apolitical men and women who lead the U.S. military, the challenge of defending the nation in the face of climate change is daunting. He's Michael Klare, this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Lutis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. Alongside me is my friend and co-host G. Wayne Miller of the Providence Journal. Each week we talk about big issues with great guests, authors, scholars, artists, and more to make sense of the stories that shape public life in the United States today. To help us this week, we're joined by Dr. Michael Klare, the Five-College Professor Emeritus of Peace and World Security Studies at Hampshire College. He's also the author of a new book, All Hell Breaking Loose, the Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change. Michael, thank you so much for being with us.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
So, the Obama administration declared climate change a national security issue, and the Pentagon followed suit with a bunch of different initiatives, programs, many of which you document in your book. Was the leadership in the Pentagon responding to just their political masters, or was this a conviction that was deeply held amongst the leaders in the Pentagon?
No, indeed, this came from the military up, because people in the military establishment, particularly people who had served in war zones in Africa, in the Middle East, who had seen firsthand the impact on climate change on countries that were highly exposed to the effects of climate change, drought, water scarcity. They saw that increasing the level of conflict and chaos in the world. They became concerned, and it was they who were pushing the administration to take the issue seriously as a national security threat.
And so once it has that sort of designation as a national security threat, what are the secondary and tertiary consequences of that kind of declaration?
It means that the whole military establishment has a responsibility to take action wherever you are in the military services, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines. Each were instructed to do what they could to prepare, to adapt to climate change, and also to try to reduce the threat of climate change by reducing their own contributions.
But so on that first piece, it's about how do you operate in an environment that's changing because of climate change. So if you're operating in the desert, you have to be able to operate armored units at higher temperatures. Or in the Arctic, now you've got sea lanes that were never open before. Is that what we're talking about?
Precisely, but more importantly, and increasingly with time, to harden American military facilities at home that are highly exposed to things like sea level rise, extreme storm effects, floods, droughts, fires. Many of our most important bases in the United States, like Norfolk Naval Station and San Diego Naval Base on the West Coast, are right at sea level. They're increasingly attacked by extreme storms, and with sea level rising, they're at risk of becoming inoperable in the future. So for that reason, this is a very serious consideration for the Department of Defense.
So take those two examples, San Diego and Norfolk, which, as you mentioned, of course, are two centers for our fleet. What is being done there now, specifically to, quote unquote, harden against? I mean, you can't move all that somewhere else. Obviously, you can't, I mean, it's ridiculous. You can't put it inland. So what are they doing?
So they're raising the piers because they were too low as the water rises, and the piers were at sea level. Now they're being raised. That's one thing they're doing. They're building seawalls around critical facilities, and also particularly moving sensitive equipment like electronic equipment that was at ground level to upper levels when new buildings are built, and moving them away from the floodplain, from the immediate low coastal areas, away from that to higher elevations. Those are some of the things they're doing. But on the mitigation side, they're also reducing their reliance on fossil fuels by building solar panels and other renewable sources of energy.
Is construction already underway on these initiatives that you mentioned, raising piers, moving different assets to higher ground?
Absolutely. All over the United States and in Alaska.
Is there a dollar figure attached to this? I mean, you're talking about...
Sounds expensive.
Yeah, like really expensive.
Well,
you have to do it, of course, but it sounds like a lot of money.
Yeah, well, consider this. In 2018 and 2019, you had three major events. Hurricane Florence, which utterly destroyed Camp Lejeune in North Carolina.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Hurricane Michael utterly destroyed Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida. And the heavy floods of last year flooded Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. The total cost of damages is estimated at $10 billion.
Wow.
So those are just three bases. Many others were destroyed by those hurricanes. They'll all have to be rebuilt.
So I want to go back a second. The concern in the Pentagon predates all of that. You mentioned how it first came on their radar looking at what was happening overseas with foreign governments. Give us a time period when that began to be seen as a threat by the Pentagon. This is years ago, I assume.
Yes. The first time that the Department of Defense officially recognized climate change as a threat was in 2010 with their quadrennial defense review of that year, which is their summary of the strategic statement. And they talked about how drought and water scarcity and food scarcity was increasing the risk of conflict around the world. They used the term threat multiplier, that in countries that were already fragile because of ethnic discord, resource scarcity, corruption, hostility between the people and the government, that when climate change increases the severity of those effects, drought in particular, that could be the force, the straw that breaks the camel's back, that you have state collapse, warring factions, chaos, and the rise of terrorism. That's what they were seeing in their tours of duty overseas.
So, this is, the 2010 QDR happens under the Obama administration. The 2018 events and many of the things that you describe in your book seem to fly in the face of the Trump administration's stated and public hostility to climate science and just even the discussion of climate change as a man-made phenomena. How does the Pentagon operate and make these decisions and make these investments in that political environment?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the language that's employed. President Trump has said climate change is a hoax, and he's rescinded many of the Obama-era executive orders that called for all of this kind of action. And many of his top officials have said no more climate change, we're not going to talk about it. But the military still has to worry about its bases that are at risk. So some of this entails using euphemisms. Instead of climate change, they're talking about strange weather patterns or extreme weather events or changing weather behavior. So a whole language is being created to get around this problem.
Is there something dangerous, though, in having to rely on euphemisms and not just sort of,
the facts?
Calling it what it is, right?
Yes.
Is there a danger in that? I'm thinking even a moral danger, right? In terms of not speaking truth to power.
Well, absolutely. And there also is pressure coming from the communities where these bases are located, because the communities around, say, Norfolk Naval Station or San Diego are occupied by people who work at the base, the contractors, the service people who are deployed there. And many of these communities tend to be conservative and represented in Congress by Republicans, and they're also affected by the same climate effects. So those communities are becoming more active around these issues. So you have Republicans in Congress who are beginning to move on this issue. Careful about the language, but there is a climate solutions caucus, bipartisan caucus in Congress that's calling through the defense budget to take action around climate change that you don't see anywhere else.
Talk about the title of your book and what it really means. All hell breaking loose. You've given an example, many examples in terms of what the Pentagon is doing to prepare for the future. But it means more than that. You also talked a bit about migration and all of the changes geopolitically that are happening.
Thank
All
you.
hell,
yes. So,
And I do have another question, just a joke.
so
Go
I,
ahead. So what does it mean?
Well, I speak
Break that down.
I
Yeah.
speak in my book about a ladder of escalation, a new kind of ladder of escalation where climate change will intensify over time, and that the dangers that we see will not happen sporadically, but will increasingly occur in conjunction, one after the other in close conjunction, which is what the scientists that the military has turned to are saying, that we have to expect a time in the future when you'll have multiple crises occurring abroad, state collapse of major states, think Pakistan, think Nigeria or Saudi Arabia, collapsing under the weight of extreme drought conditions, extreme water scarcity, internal conflict. At the same time, the United States hit by multiple hurricanes, droughts, fires simultaneously. So the military will be torn between having to deploy forces overseas to deal with the collapse of Pakistan, a nuclear-armed state.
That's a terrifying scenario in and of itself.
In and of itself.
Yeah.
At the same time, governors in the United States are saying, we need immediate help. Send us as much help as you can provide, so that they'll find themselves in a situation where they'll be unable to carry out their primary function of defending the United States.
So the Pentagon can't possibly handle all of these crises happening at the same time. Is that true?
If they're also trying to have the capacity to defend the country, in Europe and in the Pacific against Russia and China and North Korea, to do that and deal with all of these other emergencies simultaneously. And they see all of this occurring with pandemics and mass migrations. These things have occurred already, but one at a time. But imagine all of them happening simultaneously, which is what people project is likely in the future. So we have the coronavirus happening now, but picture more of those and multiple hurricanes and wars erupting. This is the worst case scenario.
That's all hell breaking loose.
This is all hell breaking loose at the uppermost on the ladder of escalation of climate change.
I wonder if you could so you mentioned Pakistan, a nuclear-armed state that has fought several wars with its neighbor India since its independence. I'm wondering if you can sort of explain to us how might climate change trigger state collapse in a place like Pakistan?
So this is a country that the intelligence community has waved a red flag about in this respect. Pakistan is a country that is already deeply divided along ethnic grounds. It's a country where elites control a large part of the land, and that's because they also control water irrigation rights. So there have already been riots and protests leading to deaths over water scarcity and electricity scarcity. All of their water comes from one source, the Indus River. It originates in the Himalayas, most of it. And under climate change, the glaciers that feed the Indus are likely to disappear. So you'll have periods of time when the Indus could run dry, creating, mass water scarcity and chaos and rioting over water supplies in Pakistan. And you can imagine a situation where the military breaks apart and some elements of the military who are tied to terrorists take these nuclear weapons and use them for who knows what. Now, I'm describing a worst-case scenario,
right,
but it's one that the U.S. Department of Defense is concerned about and has prepared for and has contingency plans for intervention in exactly that scenario.
Do you know what those plans are? How could we intervene?
Well, there are special operations forces that have prepared to airdrop into Pakistan to seize those nuclear weapons before they could fall into terrorists or other, jihadist or hostile factions of one sort or another. And this could, lead to unimaginable consequences.
So, worst case scenario, all of these crises happening simultaneously, both domestically and abroad. Sounds like a Stephen King novel, but obviously...
Or a Tom Clancy novel.
Or more appropriately, a Tom Clancy novel. From an Uber point of view, from the larger picture, what can the American government and the American people do now to prepare for such possibilities? Which, worst case is worst case, but worst case doesn't mean impossible. It means it could happen.
Well, the Department of Defense in the Quadrennial Defense Review and in 2010 and 2014 and more recently says some of the things that can be done. And one of them is to enhance the resiliency of bases, but that's exactly what communities could do, to examine what is your exposure, what are your vulnerabilities, what will happen to your infrastructure, where will electricity and water come from under a worst case scenario, and how can you prepare for that, and what new sources of water and electricity can you build in light of what you determine are the vulnerabilities. That's one thing you could do. But they also say we have to work, they say we will work with the militaries of other countries, of friendly countries, to do the same thing in their country, especially those that are at greater risk even than the United States. So it does require international cooperation. There's no other way, there's no way to avoid working cooperatively with other countries to reduce their exposure.
It sounds to me like, the climate debate, when we're talking about controlling carbon emissions, often comes down to a question of what are you willing to pay now versus what are you willing to accept in the out years, right? But what it seems like you're saying to me is that whether we get our arms around carbon and reduce it, or we don't, the U.S. military is going to have more tasks on its plate because of the effects of climate than they do right now.
Exactly. And of course, they will say, our primary job is to defend the country against Russia, China, and the
Fight
like.
and win the nation's wars.
Yes.
Yeah.
But what they see is that climate change will make that increasingly impossible. It will impair their abilities one way or another, either by making their domestic infrastructure unusable or by creating chaos around the world, threatening American security.
So, you mentioned the escalatory ladder that you describe
Yes.
in the book. So, we talked about sort of what happens when all hell breaks loose.
Yes.
But at that lower end, if we think about humanitarian relief, why would climate change make the U.S. military busier at that lower end of the conflict spectrum?
At the lower level, they speak about those humanitarian missions as a lesser included case. Mm-hmm. That is, they'll use the forces available to provide humanitarian assistance. And this is seen as a non-combat kind of activity. That's easy. But the next level would be going into places, say Nigeria, which is another country they worry about, where the U.S. is already helping the Nigerian government deal with Boko Haram, the terrorist group. Boko Haram is feeding off of climate change. Climate change is causing extreme drought in northern Nigeria. It's displacing farmers who are moving into other areas, creating ethnic strife, and Boko Haram is exploiting that. The Nigerian military is unable to cope, so the U.S. is helping them, and you could picture this getting worse and worse. And so a humanitarian mission in Nigeria would not just be sending people to hand out food and water. You'd have to send armies to protect them. So it moves from a humanitarian mission to a civil war kind of a situation.
So I think one of the criticisms is, why is that the United States' problem?
Because we see that the breakdown of a country like Nigeria would have repercussions that affect the United States. It would enhance international terrorism. Boko Haram. There's also a branch of ISIS operating in northern Nigeria, so they would have more space in which to launch terrorist activities. But more importantly, I think the worry is that Nigeria is also a major supporter with the U.S. of counterterrorism activities throughout Africa. But also there's the worry about mass migrations, and not just in Africa, but in Latin America and Asia, that climate change is going to trigger mass migrations of peoples fleeing drought-afflicted areas, moving wherever, and creating more and more chaos wherever they go.
And this is already happening.
This is already happening.
This is not 10 or 5 years in the future.
No,
this is today and now.
No, this is happening.
I want to make sure that we take a moment to talk about the Arctic.
Please.
And the unique challenges that climate change is going to pose for the U.S. military and allied militaries operating in a part of the world that typically we have not thought of as being a contested space for great power militaries.
Absolutely. Well, let's begin with the fact that the melting of the Arctic ice cap is the most visible, prominent, major effect of climate change to date. It's something that you could measure from space. You could watch the ice cap shrink. So and that shrinkage has powerful geopolitical implications, because you have an ocean that previously was untouchable. Now people could go there to drill for oil and natural gas. So it's becoming an area with geopolitical significance, and everybody's rushing up there to get a hold of whatever territory they want, especially Russia, but also China and the United States and Canada and the NATO countries. So now the Navy has a whole new ocean it feels it has to defend. So that's more responsibilities. At the same time, climate change is damaging the military's facilities in Alaska. Alaska is very hard hit by climate change. A lot of U.S. military installations are on permafrost, and that's thawing, so the bases are becoming inoperable.
Wow.
You spoke a bit about climate change increasing the risk of global pandemics. And as we tape this, we're watching one emerge now. What is the cause and effect between climate change and the increased risk? How does climate change increase the risk of a pandemic?
So it's really a combination of climate change and mass migrations and globalization. So globalization, we see how that plays out with the current pandemic.
Right.
But in the case of the way climate change affects this is it's making many parts of the world hotter and moister. We see this in our own country. And so areas that were once temperate in southern Europe, in the southern United States, are going to be more tropical-like in the future. And this is going to facilitate the spread of mosquitoes. And mosquitoes are carriers of many infectious diseases, like the Zika disease and malaria in particular.
Which remains a global killer.
Yeah.
Yes, and it's spreading. Malaria is spreading into areas that were previously unaffected. So you could have And combine that with the fact that climate change is pushing more people into densely packed cities, coastal cities in Africa and Asia and Latin America and Central America. So you have the greater risk of contagion occurring.
Person to person communication
Person to
of
person,
disease.
yes.
We've got about a minute left, and I'm wondering if you can just describe for us the whether or not this is a very serious and sobering discussion. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about, I don't know, the future of humanity? I mean, not to be too grandiose about it, but
Yes.
No, but
this
that's
is
the basic
kind
question.
of dark
Yeah.
stuff.
Yes, well, I think people need to be listening to what the military is saying about how climate change is a national security threat. And I hope that this possibly opens up a wider discussion about climate change. I think right now there's a stalemate to some degree between those who think it's not a serious issue and those who do. But I think people need to hear that this is not just a question of higher temperatures. It's a question of a threat to the survival of our country. And if people take it more seriously in that respect, maybe we could take the actions that'll be necessary to forestall the most extreme effects of climate change.
Your book is an important contribution in that. Michael, Klare, thank you so much for being with us. The book is All Hell Breaking Loose. It's worth the read. That's all the time we have this week, but if you want to know more about Story in the Public Square, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter or visit pellcenter.org, where you can always catch up on previous episodes. He's G. Wayne Miller. I'm Jim Lutis, asking you to join us again next time for more Story in the Public Square.